Hi all and welcome to Lesson 9. This will actually be our last lesson for the course. Free you up for Module 10 to just work on your final paper. This is, a happy but sad moment for me. I'm very happy to be, completing the course material and nearing the end of the course as always, but more so, I'm sad that this will be our last go-around together. I've really enjoyed reading your discussion board posts and just getting the opportunity to record these lectures for you. I hope they're useful in some way. But thank you for your part making this a wonderful experience for me this quarter. Before we dive into the content, I want to give you just a little bit of an overview of what we're doing in this final lesson. So in terms of our study of genre, we're completing our studies of poetry and our studies of fiction in this lesson with our third and final foray into each of those genres. In Lesson 8, we completed our studies of rhetoric and drama with our final analyses of each of those. Here we're doing Poetry 3 and Fiction 3. So for poetry, this time we're going to focus on short lyric poetry. We've gone from the long, sprawling epics of the Odyssey, which was narrative poetry that tells a story or a narrative, to dramatic poetry, which tells a short story focused on a specific scene with a specific speaker, to lyric poetry, which is what you most probably commonly understand or are familiar with as poetry. Narrative and dramatic poetry are probably not what immediately comes to your mind when you think of poetry. So lyric poetry is the very short poems, just a few lines, like the examples I have in this lesson are both 12 lines, but 12, 16, 20 lines, something short, that rather than telling a story, rather than telling a narrative, it discusses a specific subject, like describing a flower or describing a certain scene. In this case, in terms of the lecture, describing a panther and a swan. And so when you go all the way from narrative poetry, which is pretty easy to read, to dramatic poetry, where you have to know some context and some things, but still fairly easy to follow the linear narrative, to lyric poetry is a bigger leap, because since lyric poetry doesn't follow a narrative, it heavily relies on what we call the poetic devices or poetic language. So specific things the writer can do with language that are pretty unique, very common to poetry, and not common much anywhere else. And so lyric poetry then becomes almost like another language. And so with lyric poetry, you have to interpret, or you could even say translate, that other language to understand what the poetry is saying. And that can be challenging, but I would argue highly rewarding. And I'll go into that more later in the lecture. But I'm going to do two specific things in this lecture to help train you to read lyric poetry. And so one is I'm going to give you some poetry terms. These are the poetic devices or poetic language things that are unique to poetry I mentioned a minute ago. And so on the next slide, we'll look at 8 or 9 of these poetry terms. And on Canvas, I've got an article or a link to a very short article that goes over, I think, about 30 or 40 terms of language or poetic devices that are unique to poetry. And so this can be kind of like teaching you how to translate, giving you the means to go from poetic language to just standard English so that you know the meaning of the poem. That's one thing I'll do for you. Second, for you, a few slides after that, I have a slide on tips for reading short lyric poetry. So you can't read it the way you just read a novel or a story or even a longer narrative or dramatic poem. You have to give it its own treat it its own way, and read it in a very special way where you spend a lot of time on just a few lines, but you'll get a lot out of it. That's the poetic experience. A lot packed into a very short space, disguised by fancy language. I'm going to, with a couple of slides, give you the means to interpret that so you have a very rewarding reading experience. And along those lines, my approach to the discussion board is also different for this particular lesson. Instead of giving you a set of questions, I've uploaded a ton of short lyric poems to Canvas, and there's only one question, and that asks you to pick any of those poems and do an analysis of it. So you'll write up kind of summarize the poem, and then say what you think the meaning or the message is, and finally say what you think is significant or important about that meaning or message, what we learned from the poem. So what is it saying? What does it mean? Why is that message important? And when you do that, and you're on average about 250 word summary, you also will use two or more, at least two of these poetry terms we're going to go over on the next slide. So that way you'll get kind of some practice with interpreting lyric poetry. There's another class you'll have to take if you go the literature route for English studies, not necessarily if you go the rhetoric route, but that class is English 271, Introduction to Poetry. There you'll take these terms I'm going to show you in a minute and explore them for the whole 10 weeks, for the whole quarter. So that's why I've waited till lesson 9 and why I've not given you a more robust introduction to poetry in this course, because there's a whole other course about that. But because this is an introduction to genre, and lyric poetry is one of the very important genres, we are skimming the surface of it here and getting you some practice before you take, ideally before or close to when you take 271. So that's the poetry portion. The fiction portion, what I wanted to do is two things. One, give you a very modern story, because with fiction, we've gone chronologically from the birth of short fiction in the middle of the 19th century to these very 20th century concerns and barn burning and Sonny's Blues. So now I want to come up closer to the day and give you end with a very modern story. But I also want to, because fiction itself has subgenres. For instance, you have short stories, you have novels. You also have something in between the short story and the novel called the novella, which is a very short novel. So I want to give you some experience with subgenres of fiction, because we haven't done that yet. We've only looked at 4 stories, in addition to giving you a very modern piece. So what I've decided to do is actually make this lecture 3 parts, and the fiction portion will be divided up into 2 parts. So it's a little bit more reading this week, but you have all of next week to just do your paper. So you should have plenty of time to get this done. And so in part 2, we'll read a relatively short story, closer to the length of the stories you've read so far, and that'll be a very modern story. And then in part 3, we'll get at the idea on the screen here of narrative complexity, and we'll read a novella. Still not very long, not that much longer than the short stories we've read, not anywhere near a novel, but still somewhat longer. Technically speaking, a novella just meets the minimum requirements for novella length, and that tale is called Un Cœur Simple, or A Simple Heart, by Gustave Flaubert, one of my all-time favorite stories. Love this piece of work, but it was a very strange piece when I first read it, so I'm going to try to help build a bridge for you to seeing what is so great about this seemingly strange tale. And it's a little bit older. It's from the 19th century, but you're getting a very modern piece before that. And then what you'll see is narrative complexity. There's a couple ways to look at narrative complexity. One would be to give you a story with a lot of characters, but you can't really do that until you get to a novel. The complexity of plot and range of characters that are possible in fiction, you only really see in a novel. And with all we have to cover in this class and it being online, I just did not want to make you read a novel. So what we're getting is a novella. And instead of range of characters and plot complexity, giving you a story that tells a person's entire life is my goal there, so that you still see narrative complexity. So if you recall from lesson 3, Poe argued that the short story, the tale, was superior to the novel because the action was condensed into a small space, and it's incredibly powerful. I think that's what is unique and wonderful about short stories and why I love reading them, but there's a degree of complexity that is just not possible in short fiction, and that's why, while I appreciate what Poe says, and it helps me appreciate short stories, I disagree, and I do not think the short story is a superior form. So I wanted to show you some glimpse of narrative complexity as a subgenre of fiction before we close out the course. We don't have time to read a novel, so I'm giving you a novella that is complex and that it depicts a person's whole life and is one of my all-time favorite works of fiction, and I'll help you see, ideally, what's so powerful about it. So, lyric poetry, modern fiction, narrative complexity. This is our final lecture for the course. I hope you enjoy it. For our poetry, like I said, you're going to have all those poems to choose from on Canvas, and they're in a file on Canvas under the section called Files, in a folder called Lyric Poetry. You can choose any of those to do your write-up. But I'm going to demo for you now, model for you what I want you to do by analyzing two of Rainer Maria Rilke's poems. He's one of my all-time favorite poets. So you have his poem The Panther and The Swan. They both focus on animals. We'll see what he does with animals, which is really cool and unique. I love Rilke. He's one of my favorite poets. That's why I'm using him for the demonstration here. Because I think he gets at the big questions. He takes small things like animals and uses them to pose big questions like, what is the meaning of the universe? Does God exist? These really big questions that all humans ask. So that's why we're doing Rilke as a demonstration. And so we'll look at the poetry terms, then we'll look at a little bit of his biography, then we'll look at the tips for reading lyric poetry, and then I'll do my demonstration by analyzing two of his poems. And here you have a panther in a cage. So you can see how this great beast, powerful animal, is forced to move slowly because it's inside a cage. That's the kind of powerful thing we'll get to when we analyze Rilke's poetry in a minute. We'll start by going over some of these poetry terms from the reading on Canvas, then look at Rilke's background and the tips for reading short lyric poetry, and finish with the actual analysis of the poems, of course. So I would recommend you really read that document. It will be so helpful to you for your further studies of lyric poetry. And there's a lot of terms on there that are pretty crucial to reading and interpreting lyric poetry that I'm not going to cover in this lecture for the sake of time. I mean, how bored would you be if I covered all 40 of them? But these, I think I've picked about 9 here I'm going to go over on this slide, are some of just the most commonly used, most important ones, though the others are very frequently used and important as well. And I'd love to see you use some of these in the analysis you do on Canvas, or ones I haven't included here, so that it can help prep you for just further potential studies in lyric poetry. Alliteration. You've probably heard this one before. It's the repetition of identical sounds at the beginning of words. So it's, in advertising all the time, because if you have two words that basically begin with the same letter or the same sound, it sticks in your mind. An allusion is essentially like a reference, but it's unacknowledged. So the poet is assuming something about their audience, some kind of prior knowledge they have. They'll just get this reference without any kind of mention of what the reference is. An end-stop line. A line ending in a full pause, usually indicated with a period or a semicolon or some other punctuation mark that makes the reader stop. So this is really, really crucial. More crucial than it sounds just from reading that short description. When you look at the lyric poetry reading tips, you'll see. So in my tips for reading lyric poetry, one of them is reading it out loud. And this is the reason why, is punctuation becomes very important in lyric poetry, because rhythm and timing is very important. So if you have something like a period or a semicolon, that's punctuation. That's the end of a sentence, right? So when you're reading that, that signals to the reader a pause, a longer, fuller pause than a comma. And if it's an end stop line, that means it's at the end of the line of poetry, because a lot of times you'll have multiple lines before there's punctuation, and they'll just keep going, maybe 3, 4 more lines with no punctuation. So you just keep kind of reading at a normal speed. Then you the poet throws in a period or a semicolon, then you stop. Sometimes it'll even happen in the middle of a line. Sometimes it'll be at the end of a line. And so an end stop line is a line where it is at the end of a line. And the poet, the author, will be very strategic about when they want you to stop. That punctuation is important to how they do that. Enjambment is a line having no end punctuation but running over to the next line, which is what I just mentioned, where you have like 2, 3, or 4 more lines, without punctuation. And sometimes enjambment will be oftentimes the period, the semicolon in the middle of a line. So you stop there. Again, for an intentional reason on the poet's part, they want you to feel or experience something with the pacing at which you read it. And our minds are trained to stop when there's punctuation, but when we're reading inside our heads, we tend to just kind of move at the same pace no matter what. Reading out loud, we tend to observe the rules of punctuation more so, and that's why reading out loud is so crucial. Hyperbole is overstatement, and litotes is understatement. You see hyperbole more often, but this is like saying something like, my head exploded or my face melted. It didn't actually happen, but what did was so thrilling or exciting or amazing, you use the overstatement to convey that. You can use hyperbole in all different ways. That's just one example. A metaphor is a comparison between two unlike things. So it's saying this literally is something. It's a sauna in here, just to describe that a room is hot, even though it's not literally a sauna. But you say that it is. This is probably one of the most, or maybe the most commonly used poetical devices. It's so common. Poets are always making these kinds of comparisons. Onomatopoeia is a sound where the word sounds like its name. So crash or smash, that kind of a thing. A paradox. I know we've talked about paradoxes in this class. They're so important to literature in general, but it's a contradiction that is nonetheless true. As I've explained it before, having two things together in a text, both present, that are opposites, but they're not in conflict. They somehow work together beautifully. Finally, personification, which Rilke uses quite frequently in his poems, is attributing human characteristics to non-human things or abstractions. So some of the animals that we'll see in the panther and the swan, he attributes certain characteristics to them that we usually observe or see in humans. And Rilke takes personification, you could say, to a whole other level. So we'll talk about that more in the Rilke portion of the lecture. As I've said, these are just some of the most common ones. Please review the whole document and use these or others in the poetry analysis you do for the discussion board. I will say some of these can appear in other places. Things like paradox, metaphor, hyperbole, personification, maybe even those certainly show up in fiction too, just more often in poetry. Some of them, like in stopline and enjambment, you only really see in poetry. And then others like alliteration, onomatopoeia, personification, allusion, those could be in both. They're just much more common in poetry because they have to do with language and hearing things. You don't really read novels out loud very often, but people frequently recite poetry out loud. Hey, so a little bit about Rilke himself, since he's the poet we're studying for my demonstration of using these terms in analysis. He had a difficult childhood because he had an older sister who had died at a very young age, and that was incredibly traumatic to his mother. And so she, to kind of, you could say, I guess, cope with the loss of her daughter, she dressed him as a girl, and that just obviously was confusing to him. And it's after the lecture on Sonny's Blues and what the narrator and his wife Isabella experienced with the death of their daughter Grace. Hopefully we can all, see here how we're getting a bit of a window into some family trauma that clearly, for a variety of reasons and in a variety of ways, influenced Rilke throughout his life and shaped his life. He had a number of different occupations early in his adult life before settling into a career as a poet. went to military academy, business school, worked at a law firm, and also at the University of Prague. None of those were really great fits for him. His literary career began when he published 2 books of poetry in between his work and studies. So time at the University of Prague, some of these various jobs, he was able to, in between those things, work on some books of poetry, and finally got 2 books of poetry published. That's when his literary career took off. His personal relationships: in 1897, he fell in love with the married psychoanalyst Lou Andreas Salome, and so they weren't able to have a relationship in the traditional sense. And she was already married, but she was they corresponded and whatnot. She was a lifelong influence on his poetry, and she was a psychoanalyst, which was interesting. Rilke was writing at the beginning of the 20th century, when right around the time Freud was first writing and psychoanalysis was being born as a field of studies. He got to go to Russia in 1899, where he met Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist of the 19th century, who was a huge influence. And so he was swayed and influenced by Russian mysticism. Just seeing the landscape there, it's such a breathtaking, dramatic countryside to see. That was really influential. And those first couple of volumes of poems, that was his first success. He wrote the first one while in Russia there. His wife, he married Clara Westhoff, and they were artists, part of kind of an artist colony, living in the area of Wapswede, Germany, but it didn't last long. They soon separated. After that, so he's kind of lived all over the world. He was like one of the first artists or writers we think of as like a cosmopolitan. So Russia, and then Germany, and then next Paris. And in Paris, he met another writer named Auguste Rodin, and they became good friends. And Rodin was very influential on Rilke, just helped Rilke master his craft. And so really the more kind of technical elements of writing poetry, which is what he didn't have pinned down yet, even though he'd had some early success. And so after this friendship with Rodin, he wrote a collection called New Poems, which is probably one of his most successful volumes. That's where the poems we're studying today came from, and so he dedicated that volume to Rodin. In 1911, he stayed at Duno Castle when he was the patron of Princess Marie von Thurn. This was an incredibly influential experience. He wrote a set of poems called the Duno Elegies while he was there, and those are considered like his crowning achievement. They're longer and more complex than the poems we're studying in this lecture, but they're well worth your time to read. If you're interested in poetry, one of my highest recommends. And this was near the end of his life. He served in World War I, but was discharged in 1916. So he'd begun the Duno Elegies at Duno Castle a few years before the war. He left to serve in the war, then it was discharged, I think, due to injury. And after the war, he was able to finish the elegies. And so there's really, if you read the Duno Elegies, you can really see the trauma of World War I, especially with him beginning the elegies before the war, finishing them after his discharge. You see kind of the transition. That is really the mark of the changes of the modern world and how World War I embolized our transition as a world society from kind of a pre-modern period to a modern period. World War I shattered our innocence. The Duno Elegies captures that beautifully. He also had a long collection of sonnets, the sonnets to Orpheus. Those two are considered his 2 greatest works. Both began just before the war, finished after, and then he died shortly after this. So what are the main threads we're going to pull on as we study his poems here? He considered art an essentially religious activity. He was not religious in what we would call the traditional senses, and he was not, say, a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or something, but his poems are very spiritual, and so he considered art a religious activity. He was seeking a comprehensive vision of cosmic unity. That sounds like this big, weighty thing, and it is, but what he really means here is that since he wasn't religious in the traditional sense, he was seeking, you could say, a religious kind of an answer through his poetry and his art. And so, cosmic unity, who is God? What is the universe? He's trying to answer those questions through his art and his poetry. He was haunted by the incompleteness of human experience and the passage of time. This is a statement I read about him in a biography I was reading once of him, and I think it really describes him well. Like, I talked about his experiences in World War I, and just seeing the pain, suffering, trauma he saw in his lifetime, living in some difficult years from the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century. He was haunted by the passage of time, the toll it takes, excuse me, and moreover, the incompleteness of human experience. So you connect these 3 points together, 1, 2, and 3 here, you see a clear connection. That he wasn't religious in a traditional sense, but he sought religion or spirituality through his artistic vision and tried to answer the big questions. And in that process, he saw the incompleteness of human experience. So even though he had rejected traditional forms of religion, he knew that the human experience wasn't the end-all be-all. There had to be something more. He didn't quite decide on what, but I think he came close in his kind of secular spiritual explorations here. For the next thread, point 4, I've divvied it up over several bullet points because it's a complex working out of what is, you could say, the common kind of trope of his art, the common thematic strand of his art. So I'm going to break that up for you into several points, and it all relates to these first 3 points and his vision, his goal. So he called his poems thing poems, which is a translation from a German word I'm not going to strive to pronounce for you right now, which is physical reality, absolute otherness, and thing-like nature. So by looking at something like a panther or a swan, that is very other, absolute otherness from the human form. That's a physical thing. It exists in physical reality, so it has a thing-like nature. But there's a spiritual element going on to connect to the 3 previous points here. So the physical reality is like a conduit to something greater. And that's the importance of the thing-like nature of things. Essentially, you could say in another way, looking at the created world, the physical reality, and seeing how that leads to other things. He was really into ancient artifacts. One of the poems that's in the folder, but I'm not going over in this lecture, is Archaic Torso of Apollo, where he sees the torso of the statue of Apollo from I think ancient Rome or Greece, and writes a poem about it. And so when he looked at objects, because he didn't just look at animals, although I'm doing the lecture on the animal poems, when he looked at objects like the torso of Apollo, he saw it as this thing from the past, but detached from that. So because of this thing-like nature, in and for itself, this thing has an essence or being, and having the poetic spiritual moment with that, leads to a conduit to greater things. These things are alive with a strange vitality when under the poet's gaze. So in terms of how these created things lead to something greater, that process happens when the poet looks at it, starts writing about it. So a physical presence that transcends words challenges the viewer on an existential level. I think here we have what is beautiful about lyric poetry, and why I wanted to use Rook for this lesson is the poet looks at the panther or the swan or the statue or something, and there's an experience there where the poet tries to put it into words and does the best they can, but it transcends that. That's why it's a spiritual or metaphysical experience. And the words can't possibly do it justice, but the words can be kind of a conduit or a path. Through reading the words, through reading them out loud, through really engaging with the poetry, we can get a glimpse of what the poet experienced in that moment when they composed the poem and have our own transcendent, potentially, experience. So the scope of these objects shames the observer's puny existence. So just like I mentioned before, Rilke saw the incompleteness of human experience and the tragedy and suffering of the world around him. And so when you see the panther or the swan, there's this immensity of this thing that it really makes the viewer feel small, which Rilke is arguing is a good thing. It's good to see that there are things that are transcendent and greater than us, because he saw the failing of human beings, how we are not perfect creatures. And so Rilke got to the point where he didn't say there is God, I believe in God, but he got to the point where he said there is something greater than the human being and human experience and suffering, because he saw the incompleteness of that, because he saw suffering, but he also saw the things, the panther, the swan, that point to. They themselves are not greater, but they point to something greater. Something lower than humanity can point to something greater than humanity. And with this kind of transcendent experience with the animals, you have essentially personification, right? Ascribing human characteristics to non-human things, but it goes even beyond personification, because it's not just human qualities he's ascribing to these animals, it's something even greater. So finally, Rilke infuses objects or animals with ideas, emotions, and values. So an even higher form of personification than you usually see in poetry. That's what makes his poetry incredibly unique, and why I wanted to study it for this lesson. So the tips for reading short lyric poetry. It's different from reading the long epic poetry we've read, especially because what we read was in translation, so we lost some of the poetic language of it. Those kinds of things read more like a novel. This is poetry in the true sense of poetry, what probably comes to your mind when you think of poetry, more so than a long epic with a story. And probably why I would hazard to guess you've not necessarily been a fan of poetry up to this point. My goal is to convert you to being a fan of poetry, because I myself was not a fan as undergrad, had to learn to read it to be able to succeed in graduate school, and now have a great appreciation for it. So what I'll say with poetry is this: the juice is worth the squeeze, but the squeeze is quite a challenge. So poetry takes time. You may have a really short poem. Rilke's The Panther is only 12 lines. If you just sit and read The Panther at the pace you read anything else, you'll be done in less than a minute. But what I'm asking you to do here is take a poem like The Panther and take like maybe 20 or 30 minutes with it. I know that sounds like a lot, but if you do that squeeze, the juice you get out of it will be worth it. Trust me. So here's what you do at that time. Read the poem once at a normal pace to just get a feel for it. The most basic level, just get a feel for it. Then read it again, but out loud and slowly, to get a feel for the rhythm. So that first read through would be very fast, just normal pace. That'll give you kind of the language, the sound of it, because sound, language, rhythm are important. The rhythm, the pacing, will then come through in a second read if you do it out loud. Going back to what I said about enjambment, if you see where the punctuation is, if you pause, if you do brief pauses where there are commas, and you do long pauses when there are periods and semicolons, and you read it slowly out loud, you'll get more of a feel for it, really get a feel for the rhythm and pacing. And so these two reads will give you a good feel for the poem. But like I said, because of the poetical devices, poetry is almost like another language. So on your third read through, try to paraphrase in your own words what each line of the poem means by making notes in the margins. So write in the margin next to the poem. If you have it printed out, you can jot down what the line means. Just go line by line, treating it like another language, because it almost is, and translating it because it technically is English but feels like another language. You can do yourself can do the translation, and all the training you need for that is what we're doing in this lesson. So you take a short poem like The Panther. After those first 2 reads, go through it again and go line by line in your own words. Then read your paraphrase of the poem, right? It in your own words, 12 lines, 16 lines, however long it is. Finally, after you've done all of this, so you've got like at least 4 reads here, read it one last time out loud slowly again, but after you've done all of these first 4 steps. And if you on the first step had no idea what the meaning of the poem is, my guess is after the 5th time reading it, after you've done all these steps, you will. And you probably spent, at least 20, 30 minutes here if it's a 12-line poem, which is really short poem. But like I said, you're going to get a lot out of it. The juice will be worth the squeeze. Since you've gone line by line up to this point, what you now want to do is get the thing as a whole, its completeness. So try to sum up the poem and the entire poem in just a few sentences to get a sense of its unity. So in other words, if you've got a 12-line poem and you've paraphrased each line, now take just 1 or 2 sentences. And what does this mean? If someone says, tell me what the Panther's about, and you've got 1 sentence, do that. Then you'll have a very cohesive understanding of the poem. Finally, as they always recommend in this class, the so what factor. Answer the question, because now you know what the meaning of the poem is. Answer the question, what is significant or meaningful about the message of the poem? If you do this, you'll begin to experience poetry in a new way. And I think you'll really like it. All right, so now I'm going to attempt this with the Panther and then with the Swan. So I'm gonna, with like the Panther is 3 short 4-line stanzas. So I'm gonna go a stanza at a time, and I'll read the stanza slowly out loud, kind of that step 2, and then I'll give kind of like a summary of what I think is happening in that stanza, and ideally what I describe as happening in that stanza will connect back to our threads. So here's the Panther. His vision from the constantly passing bars is grown so weary that it holds no more. To him it seems there are 1,000 bars, and behind 1,000 bars no world. So hopefully you heard how I read that. For instance, his vision, pause, from the constantly passing bars is grown so weary that it holds no more. Longer pause. So he wants you to pause at the beginning so that you get the phrase, his vision. Then I didn't really stop between the 2 lines, but at the end of the 2nd line, I paused for even longer than I did after reading his vision, because it was a period. And so he clearly wants you to have like these 2 statements here, since you have a period of the 2nd line and a period of the 4th line. What's going on though? So this is clearly a thing poem with an object personified. Because the Panther is experiencing imprisonment, right? It's caged up in a zoo, like that picture I showed you at the beginning of the lesson. And it's almost as a human would. He has grown so weary that his vision holds no more. He's no longer taking in things. And it seems there are 1,000 bars, and behind 1,000 bars, no world. So I could say, if I just didn't tell you the name of the poem and just handed these 4 lines to you and said, what is he describing? And you would say, a person in prison. A person in prison, but it's the Panther. And if you look at the little footnote, you'll see that Rilke wrote this after he saw an actual panther at a zoo in Paris. So it's personification here. And why? He wants us to sympathize with the Panther in a way we might not if he were describing it, in a non-human. kind of a way, but he's describing the imprisonment in a human kind of way, so we sympathize with the panther. One quick note, I'm using a slightly different translation here than the ones I gave you on Canvas. That's because I've taught this poem a number of times, and I'm recording a brand new lecture to fit our class specifically, but I've used this particular slide multiple times before, and I didn't update the translation to the ones I gave you, but that's okay. I think it's actually good because you'll see how the spirit, the essence, the meaning of the poems is pretty much identical, but there's little slight differences. And so it'll give you an insight into translation since we've read a few things in different translations in this course. Okay, second stanza. The padding gait of flexibly strong strides that in the very smallest circle turns is like a dance of strength around a center in which stupefied a great will stands. So here, Rilke wants you to get the padding gait of flexibly strong strides that in the very smallest circle turns. He wants those two phrases, there's a pause with each of those two phrases. He wants you to really take in those two phrases and what each of them means. And then he gives you the big idea. It's like a dance of strength around a center in which stupefied a great will stands. So to go back to our threads, the physical presence of the panther challenges us existentially. What is that challenge? Well, Rilke couples the immense power, strength, speed, and intensity of the panther with his imprisoned, stupefied nature to show us the tragic horror and suffering of his captivity. So if in the first stanza what Rilke was doing was personifying the panther's imprisonment to help us sympathize with the panther, he now, here in the first two lines, addresses very panther-like qualities. In the first two lines here, the panther is not seen human because he's got flexibly strong strides. So think of this powerful jungle cat that can, run faster than a car, but he's in the very smallest of circles, so he's pacing in a small circle. Is like a dance of strength around a center. So you've got the uniqueness of the panther in lines 5 and 7 here. And then in lines 6 and 8, you have this great strength is in a prison. The very smallest of circles in which stupefied a great will stands. So this amazing creature, a creature that shames us because it's a powerful creature, unlike any human being, is trapped in a way that stupefies that great nature. And so we see the horror, the suffering of the panther there. And then that causes us to ask all kinds of questions, right? I mean, on the one level, at a kind of most basic surface level, there is the most basic level, there's this animal rights kind of thing that's important, right? Some of the things zoos do are not good, but on a deeper level, it's existential question about, a great will, great abilities, being limited, being caged, being trapped. This can ask us greater questions about ourselves, cause us to ask greater questions about ourselves and the universe. Final stanza. Only sometimes the curtain of the pupil soundlessly parts. Then an image enters, goes through the tension stillness of the limbs, and then the heart ceases to beat. So here Rilke takes us inside the mind of the panther, kind of connects back to the first stanza of where we take in an image, its eyes taken an image, goes into its body, its soul, where normally the mind would process it and say, this is what this is. But rather than having any kind of revelation or realization or epiphany from seeing an image, it just reaches the heart and dies because the painter's great will is trapped behind these bars. And so you've got the psychology of the panther. This is an extreme degree of personification here. But again, it shows us so much. Like, do you ever feel like you're trapped walking in circles, that you could be made for something greater? And how does that affect your mind as you process things like what you see? So Rilke's poems really challenge us to think and show us how small our existence is in relation to the universe, the larger world. through these powerful things like panthers and like swans. So here's the swan. This toiling to go through something yet undone, heavily and as though in bonds, is like the ungainly gait of the swan. Personification again. Here, the swan's slow gait resembles the struggles of humans. So, with the panther, you had a specific kind of imprisonment situation, and we could read that as like a metaphor for aspects of the human existence, maybe COVID-19, isolation. Here, though, it's just kind of the daily struggle, this toiling to go through something yet undone, heavily as though in bonds. So if you've seen the way a swan walks on land, it's very awkward. The human experience is difficult, it's challenging, it's full of suffering. So the ungainly gait of the swan represents that. Now, there's two stanzas here, and the second one is very short. So I'm just going to read the rest of the poem and get to do the meaning of it on the slide after that. In dying, is no longer grasping of that ground on which we daily stand, like his anxious letting himself down into the waters which receive him smoothly, and which, as though happy and bygone, draw back underneath him, flow on flow, while he, infinitely still and sure, ever more maturely and more royally, and more serenely, deigns to draw along. A lot of stuff going on here. I've got some points on the final slide, but I want to, before we go to that with the words just on the screen, I want to point out a couple of things. So a swan is a really interesting subject for a poem because it can walk on land or water and it can fly, but its walking on land is ungainly. I would go so far as to say, kind of extend the ungainliness or the awkwardness a step further and say unnatural. Its movement seems so much more natural when it's on water. And he says, in dying, this no longer grasping of that ground on which we daily stand, like his anxious letting himself down. Now that could sound like a reference to like death being freeing, but I don't think it means a literal death of the physical body, because the swan isn't dying. It's stepping off of the land onto the water. So that's what we get. The first two lines there, lines 4 and 5, set us up for the description of what the swan does when it steps onto the water in line 6. And so I think the dying, if we take the dying and combine it with the last 6 lines there, lines 7 through 12, what we get is not a dying of the physical body, but a dying to self, a letting oneself down. What does that mean? I'll get into it. So into the waters, he moves much more smoothly. Again, right, it's a more natural thing, and the waters draw back underneath him, flow on flow, while he moves even more maturely and royally, and then here, most importantly, and more serenely, deigns to draw along. That phrase means deigns is kind of, again, letting oneself down, thinking less of oneself. I believe the translation you have I actually like better is condescends to glide. So the gliding is beautiful. It's natural and beautiful compared to the gainly, awkward walking from line 3, but it's a condescension. Condescends to glide. It's becoming lower. So remember I said the idea with this focus on the poems here is these poems about animals is to, and we're talking about human existence, this kind of metaphysical existential crisis, then it's looking at something lower, animals, to get to something higher, spiritual or metaphysical experience. So I think what this poem is ultimately about is humility, dying to ourselves, letting ourselves down, leaving this earth, not necessarily dying, but going to a higher spiritual or metaphysical state, becoming lower to become greater. I think that's only possible through humility, and that's what this poem is about. To kind of sum up what I just said, I wanted to say it with the words on the screen, but now to like recap for you so it's concrete in your mind. Wilk describes human emotions, such as anxiety and happiness, the animals and objects of the poem. The swan in the water. Swan's awkward movements on land allude to, so an allusion here, they reference something but without mentioning it directly. One of our poetry terms, they allude to the struggles of everyday human existence. So he doesn't say the swan is like a human, but that reference with the ungainly gait, the personification, that's an allusion, makes us think of everyday human struggles or toils. Only when the swan leaves the earth, leaves the ground, and onto the water does his journey become more smooth. But the swan is on water rather than in the air, so his transition off the earth is a condescension, a going lower of sorts. So to respond to the struggles of human life, we must leave the earthly plane for a more spiritual realm, but do so by making ourselves low. So the only way to get to something higher, a higher state of existence, is to become lower. You translate that, the metaphors, the allusions, to see how it's relevant to human experience. How do we get higher by making ourselves low? Humility. So there you have my interpretations of the Panther and the Swan, using the lyric reading poetry tips by going line by line, stanza by stanza, reading out loud slowly for the rhythm and pacing. And that eventually gets us to the meaning. So I could go the swan line by line, and I kind of did that out loud for you, but now I could sum it up in one word: humility. And I think the meaning of why that's important is obvious. It teaches us a lesson about how to achieve a greater existence. So there you have it. Now, I'd love to see you do the same thing with any of the poems from that folder on Canvas that I've marked as lyric poetry under files on Canvas. So choose one of those short lyric poems from the folder lyric poems under files, or because I didn't have a PDF of it, one of my favorite poems by Shakespeare, Sigh No More, Ladies, Sigh No More, and that's right here on Module 8 since I couldn't put it in a folder. Spend some time closely reading the poem, using the tips for reading short lyric poetry. Then in your discussion board post, sum up the poem in just a few sentences. Use 2 or more terms, as many as you want, but at least 2, from the Poetry Terms webpage when summarizing the poem. Conclude your post by answering these 2 questions. What is the main meaning, or what is the main message or meaning of the poem, and what is significant or important about the poem's message or meaning? So if you do all that, it should get you right around the 250 words you usually need for a discussion board post. And so the first few sentences can be a summary. This is what the poem says. Then you get at what is the meaning or message of it. Finally, the so what factor, why does that matter? And when you're summarizing it, or really at any point, try to use some of the terms from the Poetry Terms webpage, because that will get you ready, prepare you to do more lyric poetry analysis as you go on in other classes beyond this. So I'm really looking forward to see what you do with lyric poetry, especially since there's so many choices. I hope if you didn't love poetry before this lesson, you might afterwards, but as a recovering non-lover of poetry, I know how hard that transition from not loving poetry to loving poetry is. But hopefully this experience helps. I can't wait to read your discussion board posts.